McLeod-Skinner, and I'm running to be Oregon's next Secretary of State. This is one of our Oregon Voices Roundtable conversations. And, I talk a lot about wanting to defend our democracy and ensure accountable government and safeguard our natural resources. But accountable government looks different to different Oregonians. And across our state, I've met so many Oregonians who feel that their voices are not being heard. That's in urban and rural areas. And Oregon has a painful history for many. And so the purpose of the Oregon Roundtables is really to have a conversation on what does accountable government look like? And in me serving as Secretary of State, how can I assure accountable government for all Oregonians? So today I'm very excited. We have some wonderful guests. And so I want to welcome both of you, Della Rae and Cole Reed. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today.
Honored to be here.
And
Absolutely.
what we're actually, two remarkable community leaders in the Portland metro area. And we're going to do things actually a little bit differently today, because usually, we'll start out with intros just to give folks some background on all of us. But then usually I lead us through the conversation, ask some key questions. But today I'm turning it over to you two, and you two are going to lead the conversation, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll answer questions and we'll just take it from there. So thanks again for participating in this conversation and being willing to kind of walk through and ask me questions or help to educate me on things that I need to understand to ensure better and more accountable government here in Oregon. So thank you again for participating. Just a little bit of my background for folks. My childhood was spent in the Midwest, in East Africa, and also Southern Oregon. I'm an Ashland High graduate. I got degrees in engineering and regional planning before I began my public service. I worked for a humanitarian organization. I had come out at a young age, and so serving was not an option in the military back in the day. So I worked for a humanitarian organization, the International Rescue Committee, helping to repair schools and hospitals in Bosnia and Kosovo. When I wanted to come back to the States, they asked me to run their refugee resettlement office in the Bay Area. And so I worked very closely with refugee and immigrant communities, helping people work towards self-sufficiency, working on organizational capacity building for community-based organizations, and also helping people become citizens and access their right to vote. I also worked in local government as a city planner, as an environmental planner for a regional water agency. Served on the Santa Clara City Council for 8 years, included the audit committee and a bunch of other committees, led around natural resources and accountable government, economic development, those kinds of things. When I came home to Oregon, went to law school, got a law degree focused on natural resource law, water law, and Indian law, and then worked clerk for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on water cases, and Klamath on water cases, was a city manager in Southern Oregon, and ran for Congress in 2018. My wife and I live in Central Oregon. I'm a natural resource attorney, serve on the Jefferson County Education Service District Board, and the governor appointed me to the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. So that natural resource focus is part of my big focus now. But that's a little bit of my background. Della Rae, would you please kick us off and provide a little bit of background to folks? And a lot of people know you already, but just for those who don't.
Oh, thanks. Jamie, first is just, I'm so excited to be here with you and with Cole, and I'm just looking forward to this conversation that we're about to have, and just really excited to be here. So my background is I am a self-agency advocate, author, and director of the Oregon Women's Health Network. I really focus on women's self-empowerment, because I think this is the way forward, is to make sure that women have the tools and understanding and self-recognition that we need, that's necessary, because women's leadership is what we need to sustain and grow this thing we call Earth. And Cole, throw it over to you.
My name is Cole Reed. I am a local entrepreneur, designer, fabricator here in town. But most importantly, my #1 job is community catalyst. The owning of something has nothing to do with honestly instilling in my community the best that I can. So that's why I'm here today. And I talk a lot about being Black in Oregon because it's very, very difficult. So when I was invited to do this, I'm just going to jump right in and say, anytime I have an opportunity to have this dialogue about how we can make it better overall, but especially for my reflection, I'm going to do anything I can to do that. But I too am honored to be here. And I'm excited already to celebrate your victory. So let's do that.
Victory is about building stronger and healthier community. And so that's what we're working on. And just to say also, it's putting this all in context. So Oregon, Oregon has a very painful history, as I mentioned earlier. And for those who know it, when Oregon first became a state, that first vote was not only to establish the Oregon Constitution, but also was to decide whether or not we would be a slave state. And part of that, records show that obviously it was decided no, but that many people voted no, not because they were anti-slavery, but because they wanted to keep Oregon very white. And Oregon at one time also had the third largest Chinese population in the country, the third largest Chinatown in the John Day area. And that is not the case now, but that was literally in my wife Cass and her grandma's lifetime, because she was actually there during a time when there's now a museum in John Day. But there's, my dad, who I met when I was a kid, he's Chinese American. So in his generation, there was also the Sunset Laws, a time when folks, people of color, were not allowed to be outside after dark. I mean, this is the context that we come from. And while Ashland, where I probably went to high school, was a hotspot for the KKK at one time. And so while I think Oregonians talk a better game at this point and talk a good game and are very progressive in many ways, what I'm hearing from folks is that's not well reflected. And so, and that's not people's experience. And to me, that means government's not being accountable, and we're not addressing, we're not being accountable to people's needs in all communities. So that's where I'm grappling. That's where I'm struggling to learn more and hear from folks and better understand people's individual experiences, but also to figure out how we can structure government so it is more accountable, not just in name, but in people's actual experience, more equitable, safer, in building safer communities.
Okay.
So
you want to start?
Yeah, I do. So Jamie, given what you just said about Oregon's history, and tie that with your experience, your actual experience around with equity and what that can look like going forward. Yeah,
some of my personal experience, my lived experience, is part of with inequity and an unlevel playing field, is in part something I touched on earlier, coming out as a young adult when I was 19. And back then in the late 80s, it was things were very different if you were out in terms of what you had access to and what you didn't have access to. Partially my experience with my dad and seeing his experience as being a Chinese American and how people treated him and seeing those experiences. But that, I still walk into a room, carry my white privilege, and the thing of being out is often a choice for folks who are in the LGBTQ community. Not everyone, but for some it is. And so there's still that sometimes choosing to be othered. So that's some of the personal experience and context I bring to it. And so my work that I've done is really throughout my life is to try to see where those gaps exist, and understanding that frustration of an unlevel playing field, trying to see where that exists and make change. And so based on where we're at right now, I think some of the real barriers that exist, I think there's huge issues for tribal communities. I mean, if we look at the Secretary of State role in terms of elections and in corporations, so access to business, and obviously audits. On the election piece, we know that there's huge discrepancies between different demographic groups in terms of turnout. And so one of the things that I talk about is both increasing overall turnout, but also decreasing the gaps between the demographic inequities. And sometimes those are with communities of color, sometimes those are with younger voters. So setting that as a metric, as a goal, and then working with community-based organizations, working with individuals to overcome those gaps. On audits, we can look at equity audits and ways that we can drill down into how resources are being spent, how communities are being served or not served. This is something I see on the Jefferson County Education Service District Board where I serve, where our population's about a third tribal, a third Latinx, and a third Caucasian. And even on businesses, I was talking to Councilmember Daniel Nguyen, who's a Lake Oswego council member. He was talking about his family's experiences growing. He's Vietnamese American, and the challenge that his family had, his parents, and they were small business entrepreneurs, and getting access to some of the some of the basic things to register their business and make sure their business was in compliance, but also that there were sometimes language barriers or internet access barriers. And these things are not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas.
How
and
are you
so
going to do that? I mean, I really want to know how you're going to go about me being less of a nigger in your state if you get this election. Quite frankly, to say that our history in Oregon is bad is an understatement for reflection. So for me, what I'm looking for is, what are some of the systematic things that you're going to put into play, not just to make it comfortable, but to make it safe and inclusive and equitable?
Thank you. So part of it is putting people into leadership roles. There's a core staff that I'd be hiring coming in. So bringing people in who have experience, have community connections, and can be sitting around the table when decisions are made. That part is really important. Building up relationships with community-based organizations and staying active in those relationships to make sure that there's an understanding of things that are coming in. Taking the safety aspect. So with audits, for example, so that using the tools of the office and what can be done. There's bringing folks in and developing leadership, but there's also utilizing those resources and those tools to identify where there's gaps. One of the conversations I've had with folks before is around inaccurate police having, the state police having inaccurate information based on some of the crime labs and some of the data and information. So going through and making sure that information is accurately portrayed so people do get a fair and equal access to the level playing field. Identifying issues in education. This is a big issue right now with distance learning. And making sure communities, and this is especially big for tribal communities and rural folks in general, have access to the resources and information they need. So it's providing access, it's providing tools, and then it's holding accountable when there's actions of, you talk about safety, and there's actions of safety and issues involving public safety departments. And public safety is everything from health to also enforcement, making sure that the systems in place are accountable, their policies and processes are accountable, and there's a drill down, there's an equity audit looking at how that work is being done so that as things are daylighted, they can be called out more formally.
So Jamie, I'm also going to ask, so when you're bringing in your own staff, what percentage are you going, I don't want to say guarantee, to look for people of color to be on your personal staff? What is that going to look like? How can you change that format of what we currently have?
Yeah, so it's bringing folks in, again, who it's a combination of reflecting communities and reflecting voices across our state, and also raising up voices that need to be heard that are at the table. And by definition here in Oregon now, that means communities of color. It means Black communities. It means tribal communities. It means Asian American communities. So it's the thing. There's often this concern of, or this challenge of tokenism. It's not about tokenism. It's about someone who has a lived experience and can understand some of the impact on different communities that would bring that perspective into decision making. And there's individual policies, like for on elections, there's something I've been talking about more recently about a specific plan to outreach to Native American communities, for example, and to ensure strategies to increase voting rates. But there's also developing leadership in communities, and that's in preparing people to step into the role and future leaders, and preparing people to be the next Secretary of State or the next governor or the next state treasurer run for office. It's helping develop that pipeline as well. And that's also work that I'm doing right now, but I've done in the past, is developing leadership within folks who bring a lived experience to leadership.
Okay. I have the next question. I'm curious, is that, so I went to one of your most recent raisers, if you will, and one of the first things that you mentioned was about equity and whatnot, and you talked a lot about that. And I'm just curious, why is this so important to you, and how does it tie to your lived experience as to why equity is so important to you?
That frustration of not having a level playing field, or that having to feel unsafe and not being able to, whether it's going, it's not being able to go into a community or a job or a school or something. It's a burden on your time and your energy and your focus when you have that kind of baggage and you have that extra burden you have to carry. One of the things is kind of tied to that. Through COVID-19 right now, we're seeing it impact the health of different communities differently, and it's proven fact that racism and a lot of these different isms have an actual impact on our personal health, and then make us more vulnerable to things, but also it makes it more difficult to just move forward and excel. And so creating a community where people can flourish, if you don't have that sense of safe space, it's hard to do that. So I've had my own experiences with that. I've had my loved ones in my family, I've seen their experiences with that. And it's a painful thing to see, and it's frustrating to experience. And I know that what I've experienced is a small piece of what many others face now and have faced in their lives. And so but it's still, it's almost a frustration that it builds up in me. So when I see other people, or I hear about other people's experience, it reminds me that of my own experience. And actually, the best way I can describe it is to quote someone else. When I was working with refugees, I would to create a kind of once a year, I'd bring in this person who would work with our staff, and they were mostly refugees themselves, and they would. It was essentially a therapist who would help people just kind of feel more connected, more grounded. And she asked this great question about our staff about, why do you help refugees? And this woman who had had a horrible experience herself, she said, because when I help others, it heals me a little bit. And I think that's why. I mean, I've had some of these experiences myself, not as bad as a lot of people, but I find it almost healing when we create an environment that it addresses those barriers for others.
Are you willing to do the job as an out lesbian, and so prolifically talking about equity in a state that is so challenging? Are you nervous about having that dialogue today with Della and I? Because I know to some, the state that we live in, it's really difficult. You're a white candidate speaking in front of, two, not only women, but two Black community entrepreneurs and leaders. And so what I'm asking you, are you going to hold them accountable? When you bring people in and we notice if there's an issue or continued issues, accountability. It's a simple question. I understand that you know what that feels like, and it's devastating to live it on a regular basis. I have a great deal of privilege, but the wealth of my understanding wrapped around my Blackness is huge, especially in a state like this. So I guess I'm just asking, accountability. I understand that it's difficult as an out lesbian. Will you be accountable to the people who look like me? I'm afraid to get stopped by the police. I'm afraid to go into the grocery store and do a return with a receipt. Accountability. Yeah, that's what I wanted to hear, is accountability. Yeah. Della, any follow-up?
I mean, that's why that's why I think this is such an important thing, and to also broaden accountability to move beyond, audits are a tool, but accountability is a much bigger concept. If communities feel safer based on the work I do, then I'm being accountable to communities. And that comes down to an individual's experience, but it means it means sitting with people, it means understanding that, and it means being responsive to it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So yeah, my follow-up is actually where, Cole, you kind of started when, you decided to have this round table with Cole and myself. Did you go through any thought process? I mean, did any part of this worry you? And if so, what is it?
So to a certain degree, because I know I bring in a certain level of privilege, and that gives me blinders to a certain degree. And and also one of the things I was both really excited about and really nervous about is this conversation right here is accountability. Usually in these conversations, I kind of lead folks through and have that conversation. I'm turning this over to you guys. I know that Cole will hold people accountable. You both will, but I know Cole will especially ask the tough questions. And that's it's not always easy to experience, but it's important that they're asked, because that's the job. That's the job. And if you're not putting yourself in the place to be asked the tough questions, you're not doing your job. I mean, when I ran for Congress in the most conservative parts of our state, I was an out lesbian. I always made sure that was part of the interviews with newspapers, and I remember, or community forums, and that was part of my intro, referring to my wife and my wife's family. And there were times when in the back of my mind, is like, maybe I don't have to say it this time, not here. But I always kind of knew somebody needed to hear it. And inevitably, people would come up to me and thank me for it. People that I was surprised. And also it made space for other people. My job is to make space, not just for the LGBTQ community, but for communities who are not being heard. And that means empowering, that means bringing to the table, that means hiring staff, that means listening to issues and understanding. I mean, the most important thing about bringing a team around you who has that lived experience is because they then are able to teach you what you don't yet know. And part of this conversation was to, in a very public forum, work through learning that I have yet to do.
I was nervous, me personally, Della, to pop in there, because what happens, in my opinion, a lot of times white leaders, politicians will look for those brown faces to add to the colorfulness of their campaign, if you will. And I have to say, I don't feel that way. And that's why I was willing to get on this phone call with you. I do support your mission. For me, it's really about not just, Black or LGBTQ, but our history is so bad in Oregon that we have to get over or through the discrepancies with our Black Americans, because we can't even get to the other underserviced communities, that are blatantly staring us in the face every day. And so I'm excited to get through this so we can assist side by side more of our community. We are losing at a rapid rate the number ones. And I think when you don't bring everyone to your round table, you have a stagnant table. I have the privilege of talking to a lot of entrepreneurs, and I always say, please, please, please get the roundest, most developed team that you can. People who will tell you no, who will tell you why they are saying yes, and who do not say yes just to say yes to appease you. And so that's why, you and I had some pretty heavy-handed conversations beforehand, and I'm proud of you. I know that you are going into this with humility, as much, actually, I won't even say as much as you can. I think that you're going into this with humility, so thank you. I meet a lot of politicians, white politicians, who aren't willing to say, I see that there is an issue. And so the fact that you're willing to acknowledge that you see that there is an issue and not make it about a campaign strategy, but about change. So I'm going to say thank you for that. I am going to press more with how you plan on doing that. Right above, we live right below Canada, and they have 50% women and 50% men, and one of the most diverse as far as ethnic on their council that they have, because he went into it that way. So I guess I'm going to press upon you again. are you going to look for the most diverse and inclusive, and of course, the best prepared people for this position?
Yes.
That's what I want to hear.
Yeah.
We hear a lot that the answer is yes. And then when it comes down to it, including our, and this isn't, Jamie, these are her constituents and followers. In my opinion, that's happened many, many times in our Oregonian government, but also as well as my personal local government in Portland. So thank you. And you are going to have my vote, and I'm going to keep pressing upon you as we go forward to do just that. Della?
Yeah.
Just to say though, thank you, because that's my understanding also, that this is not, what I'm asking for is not just support, but for that a constant accountability. And your point of absolutely the diversity, it's to bring that understanding to the table. It's not to check a box and to be able to go back and later and say, yes, I accomplished that. Look at the folks I've hired. It's to say, look, I've brought folks in who, yes, bring that diversity, but even more so are helping to make this office accountable to all Oregonians. It's even deeper. It's all that qualification and the understanding, that lived experience, because that's it. I don't even know how to say. It's not just diverse. It is diversity, and it's the diversity of thought and the diversity of experience, and a reflection. One of my kind of gut check experience, and please excuse me for just, is when I was on a planner for the city of Sunnyvale. I remember going into a council meeting one day. I was working, so the council was up on the dais, and the meeting was about to start, and I was following in behind some members of the community who were coming in to listen to projects. And I was going to be presenting on a project in my kind of day job as a planner. And there was this small kid walking in with his mom who was just in front of me. And as soon as we walked in the door, he stopped in his tracks. I almost ran into him. And he grabbed his mom's skirt and he tugged on it, and he pointed up at the dais and he said, Mom, he looks like me. And it was such a profound moment, because in that, he was also actually pointing to one of an Asian American council member, who is a very good council member, and really good community advocate. But also there was this sense of this kid in that moment started to see his potential for leadership, and saw himself in a role, a reflection of himself in a role that he had never seen before. And so representation, it's about bringing perspective. It's about making sure government works well and bringing in that perspective. It's also showing kids across our state that this is who we are as Oregonians, and this is who you yourself can become as you grow older and become part of, join public service and be part of the community. All of those things are important.
When we first came on, you guys had an opportunity to meet my family. My son, I'm an older mom, and he is my favorite human. And so any opportunity that we have to create a better understanding and a better way for young people, and I'm going to, dare I say it, openly to the public, especially our Black boys, when they're being massacred at such an abhorrent way, psychologically, emotionally, and actually, education wrapped around our brownness. So thank you for bringing what you have as far as your history, because I think that's very important. And that's why thank you for asking the question, Della. I think the fact that you seem to have an understanding, having a stepfather, coming from a town in Wisconsin, and then having an experience of being an other. And that's something for me as a Black woman, I wanted to point out to other constituents as to why I was willing to do this, is because you have some understanding of otherness, different from sexuality. Because your whiteness, no one can pinpoint you for anything else other than that. And so the fact that you understand that maneuvers you differently. And so let's just make it better. I'm very curious on how you're going to do that. So I would really like to press upon you more about how.
So one of the things, Yeah. So one of the things that we don't do enough of right now is collect data. And I'm sorry for going wonky on things, but we need to be able to show what's not working. And part of that is through collecting more demographic data. And that helps through the mechanism of this office. So there's bringing a team, there's identifying things that need to change, and there's approaching things strategically, but there's also showing through, be it an audit process or often, like, we all know this world is racist, and we all know that this world is homophobic, and it has all these different aspects that are not healthy. And some of the mechanisms, some of the pushback is a denial about it. But part of what this office can do is push back on that denial by identifying, by daylighting issues, and that's choosing what we audit and how we audit and what we focus on during our audits. But it's also collecting the data to show where the gaps are. So I mentioned in elections, I want to both increase overall turnout and also decrease the discrepancies between different demographics. We don't have some of that data now. So all it is an overall number. And it's like, yeah, that's great if we have those numbers increase. But if you look at certain demographics in our communities and the numbers are so incredibly low, that's an audit in and of itself of how we're not getting some of the turnout. And that helps to identify what needs to change. So this office is not a legislative office, but this office can help daylight what needs to change. And it's what we look for and the questions we ask and the data we collect and bringing that information forward to help, frankly, put more pressure on those making decisions and passing laws, because it's hard to blow something off if there's more information and more data there. It doesn't solve all problems, but it's one thing that this role can do. And then also that accountability on audits. Again, it's looking at specific things and daylighting that and having that be part of the public conversation, and then making sure it's transparent and people can get access to that information.
Yeah. So my question is, so it's going to go far and wide here. So I also, Jamie, from when meeting you and talking to you, the first interaction we had, I said, I think it was just so casual. I said, Jamie, really appreciate talking to you. And I did my homework, did research and whatnot. And I said to you, the one thing I don't want to have is, be on edge, look at, reading the newspaper. Can you just please be the person you say you are? Do you remember that? And you held up your hand, and you said, I am. I said, I don't want to be flinching every time the news comes on and wondering what's going to happen here. So you have really shown me in a lot of different ways, from attending different things and speaking to different people. And I joined Cole in supporting you and what you're doing. But I have a question around, you're talking about bringing in these different diversity. What is your experience of actually managing diverse groups of people and persons? And what is your learning curve around that? What do you need to do to get up to speed?
Yeah, really appreciate that question, because this is actually something that distinguished me in this role. Is I've got experiencing managing teams, managing budgets, that executive management experience in both the nonprofit sector and in the government sector as well. And so when I was managing the IRC office in San Jose, the refugee resettlement office, the question became, how are we making sure, it comes back to the accountability question, but how are we making sure that we're serving the needs of the folks that they're coming in, the communities that are coming in? And when I came in, there had been very different demographics of refugees. And then as I came in, there had been changes. And so we didn't often have culturally aware, culturally appropriate, or folks who had some of the linguistic skills. That's a huge oversight, and that's a huge gap, because we can't do the job, in my mind. We can't provide the services if we don't bring someone in, bring folks in who can help to address the needs and be responsive to it. So it's language skills, it's that culturally appropriate understanding of experiences, and it's so working. I think how that translates specifically into this role is to look at the communities we have throughout Oregon that are especially voices that are not feeling heard. I think the Black community, the Asian American community, it's such a huge monolith. You're talking everything from Pacific Islander to China to Thailand. I mean, it's such a huge, diverse community. So the Asian American community is such a huge, and that's part of the challenge also when we're looking at the monolith. Even we're talking about tribal communities. You know, we have 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon. And so making sure we've got folks who come in who can provide representation and an understanding of certain experiences of their respective community, whatever that piece looks like, but also making sure they're able to understand, you know, for example, as tribal communities, if someone were to come in who represented or a member of the Warm Springs tribe, they would, you know, part of the challenge or part of my ask would be to make sure that they also bring in an understanding and work closely with the 8 other federally recognized tribes. So it's, in terms of my experience, is to make sure that I was, and this is what I've done before, is sitting down and getting to know people on a personal level, identifying what, you know, hearing from them to make sure I was better understanding some of the, not just the community issues, but some of the things that might not be on my radar screen. But this goes beyond even the individual staff member to also close partnerships with community-based organizations, because there's also learning experience there that then brings a wider sense of experience than that individual. Because I mean, it's too much for any person they don't represent an entire, you know, an entire community. They have their experience and their lived experience. And so making sure we're managing folks and helping to build up a team, a cohesive team, making sure that an expectation across all staff, 220 staff within that the Secretary of State oversees, that there's respect for the leadership that's brought in, and there's an expectation of working to address equity issues, working to address it within the organization itself. The Secretary of State or the office oversees audits of state agencies, but part of that very first audit, in a sense, is to look internally at ourselves and saying what needs to be adjusted within the agency itself. And that's part of that introductory discussion.
Yeah.
But I'm constantly learning as I go through things, and I pride myself in trying to make sure I'm the least smart person in the room, and that is bringing in really smart people and talented people, and then constantly learning from them.
So my follow-up would be, and then Cole, I'll throw it back to you, is that, so we talk about, and I'm shifting gears a little bit, thank you for answering that question, but we talk about, you're talking about audits, which is great to be able to show data, but there's something a little bit more here around, so you can have numbers, but what about communication? What's that going to look like? Because you can talk about, here's the numbers, here's what, we know so many things about numbers, but people respond more to communication and style and consistency. So what's that going to look like for you?
So let me tell you a story about the communication. I had a colleague when I worked in Kosovo who, his name was Isa. He's an engineer that I work with, and we technically had no language in common. I speak English and so had a few words of Serbian, a few words of Albanian, and he spoke Albanian and Serbian, Serbo-Croatian, Serbian, people are calling different things, and had a few words of English. But we could actually communicate more effectively directly than through a translator who spoke all 3 languages fluently. Because communication language is very powerful, language is important, but communication is an exchange of ideas. And also, and then in working with teams in bringing in folks who have those talents and those skills of work that needs to be done. My role as a manager is to bring in the best and empower them to do really good work for all Oregonians. Set a high expectation in terms of service to everyone, but then empower them to do that work. And then, trust in when they are doing, is always my goal is always to develop a team into that next role that they will step into, in that next leadership role. And if someone steps in and is doing it well, then that's something that's great. That's they're serving the community. That's the ultimate public service. and so that piece of relationship, it depends on the individual. It depends on getting to know something about them personally, something about their family. For some people, that's the connection. There's different types of management styles, of course. Some people do rely more on the data piece, some do more on the relationship piece. And so getting to know someone's communication style, and then also what inspires them to do their best work is all part of that piece.
Yeah, and so I'm really talking about external communication as well. Just like I mentioned earlier, that attending your event, you really came out strong about equity. Do you? I want to know that that's going to be part of your external communication to continue speaking about equity, because you will have many opportunities to do so in so many different forms and ways that aren't necessarily tied to data and reports.
Yeah. And so absolutely. I mean, this is something actually I do in my role on OWeb. I'm often, I'm when I'm looking at decision making and things that are going forward, the question I'm always asking in the back of my mind is someone's needs not being met, and then how do we have a conversation about that? And I'll often ask those types of questions of staff who are presenting projects, or the outreach that we've had as an organization. I think, to me, equity is about, it's that listening piece and that constant learning, but making sure that voices and perspective are brought to the table. So that's why and I tie it back to the audits, when I talk about an equity audit, is a way to really challenge and ask organizations throughout the state, are they doing that work on the front line? So when any Oregonian interacts with any state agency, that person that they interact, they're not all going to be interacting with me. And so what I have to do is, through my team and through the work we do through the audit process and other processes as well, is to work to ensure that face-to-face experience that any Oregonian has with any member of a state agency, if that experience is not addressing and showing respect for that individual, then that's an equity issue that needs to be to be addressed. And so part of the role of Secretary of State is to help agencies better serve Oregonians. And so it's the direct role, but it's also working to have that oversight, or that be the ultimate experience that people have with state government.
I've told so many friends that I was, of course, doing this chat with you and Della. I would love for you, we have about 10 more minutes left. Why should they vote for you? They've seen my lawn sign. Definitely got some great supporters out in the community, but I would love for you to just take this time to tell us why. Why is it so important for us to vote for Jamie?
Because I will provide a different type of leadership, and it's everything from using the equity lens and trying to identify and make sure that there is, making sure that experience is understood, making sure people feel respected and heard, making sure that government is accountable, not just in the number crunching, in the bean counting sense. That part is important because we've got to follow where our taxpayer dollars are going, but also in that sense of experience. And I've got the background experience, and I've worked in this work my entire life. It's an experience that I learn as I go, and I will continue to learn in this role. But I am committed to making. I often say when I was 8, my mom told me to always leave a place better than I found it. I'm committed to making Oregon better than I found it. I'm committed to making the Secretary of State's office better than I found it, not for me, but for all Oregonians, and especially for those who are feeling so frustrated right now, and who are feeling they're not being seen or heard or respected or have a level playing field. That's the job.
I would ask that you, opposed to saying respected, afraid. I think if we're going to just, jump in, there's a true fear of what it could be, the outcome of such conversations of if I get stopped by the police, opposed if you get stopped by the police. And so thank you so much for taking the time. For me personally, as a community catalyst, anytime I have an opportunity to speak to a white audience about change or to be invited to that table, I always ask that they make the table a little bit bigger. There's always room for other people. So thank you for making room at your table and making sure that the table of Oregon has enough room for everyone's reflection. Thank you so much. Della, did you have anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think one of the most broadest ways forward is myself as a Black woman. I have not ever gotten so involved with local politics as I have around, Jim, your campaign, and it's simply because of how you are choosing to take this on and how you address things, that I think it's huge. And it's just so curious to me how, given this, and you have two amazing community leaders here talking to you and speaking with you and having this time, you know, the Democratic Party as a whole not understanding how important this very piece is.
Yeah, well, that's part of the ongoing work, and getting, yeah. But let me take this to turn this around. I mean, you've heard me. You've asked some questions. You've heard me grapple with the answers. What am I missing? What do I still need to learn from the responses I've given?
Della?
So I would say more about just keep moving and staying open and curious and pushing back on the things that you know are wrong and making sure that you stay with those things that you know are not equitable, and keeping people around you as well. As, so, you know, you have your staff and whatnot, but I'm talking about having people around you that will tell you the truth. That's what is so important. And this is what I've had so much experience, especially when it comes to white leadership. The thing happens and then it shuts down, and then there's the accountability is not 360. It's coming up, but not from everywhere else. And I think that's the missing piece in my experience that happens over and over and over with white leadership.
Can I, Cole, just before you jump in, can I just speak to that? So I served for 8 years on the Santa Clara City Council. And when first elected in 2004, when I first got elected, I was horribly naive and thought politics was all about good guys and bad guys and, you know, all this other stuff, and was really shocked at the learning I did in politics and really frustrated. So the frustration so many people have, and that tremendous pressure on you once you're in a decision-making role to fall into line. Similar to what you're talking about, Della. And I made decisions along the way, and I took stances along the way that were that put me in positions of tremendous political heat, and sometimes got a tremendous pushback, and was sometimes punished by the political establishment. But I do, so to your point, it's very well taken. I commit to doing that going forward, to staying open. And I say that because I've done that in the past. If the past is prologue, I did that in my, in my 8 years in the city council. And I sometimes paid a political price. I mean, even in this process, there are, in terms of the political process of running for statewide office, there's endorsement processes, there's things that have come up that people have said, no, because you a stance you took in the past. And it was a principled stance that I've been kind of punished for within the political operative organization. And I say that with pride, because I would take those stances again, because ultimately I believe that the role and the responsibility of being in a position of power is to address inequities and to make sure that people are being heard and the voices that are not being heard are brought forward. This is not sometimes I'm talking about now. This is stuff I've done before. And you do pay a political price for it. But I'm not afraid to pay that price because I've done it before. And to me, the legacy work is if you've made positive change. Just doing, that's, I don't know.
Jim, the only thing I would suggest is it's okay to fumble and to keep fumbling and to say, I am a person learning, growing, Something that I often do is, anyone who knows me, I will do this little stance of my feet firmly planted, but my arms up, able to receive. Continue to fumble and fail and stand up. Because even if our
Very good
failures
advice.
are some of the best
Yeah.
successes, and I think that you're doing that, and the fact that you're willing to fumble through this is nothing but success, because it makes you more humane and more real. So for me, it's keep being more humane and keep being real. And I'm excited for you to be elected and excited to hold you accountable.
Absolutely.
I invite that, and no doubt you will.
And well, in this conversation just now is
Yes.
an absolute show of who you are and what you're willing to do, because you're coming on to have this conversation. We did not rehearse and know what we're going to say. You turn, like you said, you turn the reins over to us, and just keep doing that. Keep doing that, and you will go far and wide, and you will make a difference, and people will see that. And this is what we need. This is what real leadership looks like. So I thank you for that. And obviously you have my vote.
Well,
You know, for our other white women, vote, call your relatives. And this isn't towards Jamie. I'm looking to our American public right now. Call your conservative cousins. Call your relatives. Talk to your neighbors. I'm tired of being afraid. I don't want my son to be afraid. And Jamie and I know, thank you for taking away a little less fear just in this conversation. So that is what I'm saying. It's not to Jamie, not to Della. America, vote. American white women, vote.
Well, not just vote. Let's not just vote.
Let's vote in your best.
Oh my goodness. Vote not just for your reflection, but for your community. And what we have is not community driven. It is not community focused. Vote for the focus of community. And I know I'm going to say I endorse Jamie because you're focused on your community outside of your reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. That's who we are. But voting is important, but also the majority of white women voted for the current president, who is terrorizing communities of color, especially the Latinx community. So accountable voting, search your soul and be proud of your vote. Yeah.
And I appreciate you. And I can't wait to follow more of these conversations. I would love to see what our Native American leaders, our Pacific Island, and I'm also going to personally invite you to our onesie conversation next Wednesday, so the constituents and people that I know can also hear what you have to say. So thank you very much for everyone taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you for that invite. And we've got some of these, as I mentioned, the Oregon Voices Roundtable is to bring voices forward. And I'll say it's actually sometimes challenging, because there's some folks who have been so burnt by government that they're like, okay, either, I don't want to be tokenized on a conversation like that, or I don't trust that it's just not going to be the same. So I also recognize that I have to begin this journey and earn trust and keep proving that this is what I believe. And so my point is, I know some of my experience was not in Oregon. It was either internationally or in a neighboring state, but I continue to do this work, and I recognize the fact that I have to keep proving, it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to do it. And that's something that I keep working at, but it's also something that if people look or ask, it's part of my track record, it's part of who I am. It's frankly, and we didn't talk about this, it's part of my faith as well. It's part of what drives me to do this. Yeah. But Della, I'm going to turn over to you for the.
Yeah. So my as you get to know me as well, my value is simplicity, and this is it: believe and trust Black women. Full stop.
I'm gonna just end it there. Believe and trust Black women. Full stop. Thank you so much, Jamie. I see you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right.